Hey everybody, it's my 40-gallon waterfall tank, and I'm in the middle of a project right now that may ultimately wind up affecting this tank. I'm actually in the other room and I'm cleaning out some of the buckets that I use to throw my plants in. When I clean out a tank and I got a bunch of plants left over, I got to do something with them. And so I usually just throw them in buckets. I've got some lights hanging over top the buckets, and the plants just sit in my grow out buckets. But over time, they are just stagnant buckets, and they tend to get a little funky, and some of the plants don't do so well, or I get duckweed growing in them, or whatever. So from time to time, I just have to go over there and sort those buckets out. And one of the buckets that's been kind of sitting back in the corner that I haven't been paying much attention to at all had a big piece of temple plant in it. And when I cleaned it out, I realized while it might be a little nutritionally starved, it's a little on the peaked looking side, it is a pretty big, branchy, well-rooted chunk of temple plant. And I think I might be able to get it to establish in this tank and have it growing emergent. So let's go out in the yard for a moment and have a look at it as it is now. Now, of course, the sun was shining 5 minutes ago, and now that I'm back out here, it's not. But we'll still get to have a look at my giant temple plant here. So this is the one that I'm talking about. Those little ones you see right there are actually just loose plants. But that's a pretty well-established root system on a pretty well-established plant. Again, it's just been sitting in a bucket. It had about an inch of scummy water in the bottom of it, and yet we still have that much temple plant. So the stuff's easy to grow. It's got very low light requirements, very low nutrition requirements, and as I said, you can see it's not the healthiest looking plant in the world. It's a little on the scraggly and peaked looking side, but I think if we put that in my waterfall tank, I'd probably have to feed the tank at that point. I've got so little in the way of dissolved solids and nutrients in that tank that I don't know how well it would do, but we might be able to get in there and do something with it. Anyway, that's what it looks like out here. Let me tinker with it, and we will see what it looks like once I get it in the tank. Alright everybody, that's what I came up with so far, and we'll have to just give that some time and see how it works out. So what I wound up doing was getting in there and pulling some more rocks out of the back. When I set this tank up, I really did put a lot of rocks in it, and a lot of them seem to serve no purpose other than aesthetic appeal, just to give it the appearance of a river bottom. And they literally were just rocks lying flat across the bottom with some gravel around them and on them. So I lifted a few of those up. I laid the entire root system in and down. It kind of goes around behind here. And I've laid some flat rocks on it. I tried to bury it under the gravel as best I could so it won't be disturbed. And the reason it is actually standing up, you may or may not be able to tell, I've kind of wedged it under this big piece of wood right here, so it's kind of being forcibly held up. And again, I'm hoping over time it will root in and develop enough rigidity on its own that it'll stand upright. I also took another chunk. Both of these pieces actually come off of the same one. It goes down, it sort of loops out like a horseshoe, and then comes back up, and there's a bunch of roots off of this end of it. So the roots are now underneath of this rock, and hopefully they will grow and root and sort of dig their way down into the substrate, and we'll get those two shoots growing up. So at this point, my only real concern is going to be food for the plant, and in particular the nitrogen compounds. I did dose the tank with a little bit, or I should say quite a lot of Flourish, which is trace nutrients. It's not your NPK standard macronutrients that most plants would need. And again, when I'm talking about a plant that's growing up and out of the water, it's using atmospheric oxygen, atmospheric CO2. It's got a lot of light on it. It will grow vigorously. It's going to need plenty of macronutrients in addition to the trace nutrients. So I did dose it with the Excel trace nutrients. I just put a big old sploosh in the tank, going under the assumption that 1 capful for every 10 gallons. That's the way most of these things dose. And of course, after the fact, I decided I'd read the instructions just to make sure I'd done it right. And apparently you're supposed to use 1 capful for every 60 gallons. So I super turbocharged my micronutrients, trace nutrients in the tank here, and we will have to see what effect that has, because that is my nitrogen compounds in the tank, and that's less than 5 parts per million, and that's only because that's how much is in my tap water at the moment, and I just topped off the tank. So we're running about what I've got in my groundwater, or at least what's making it through my water system. I do remove a lot of the nitrates. As I mentioned in another video, I need to work on my softening system and get the salt back in there to pull the nitrates back out. But right now about 5 parts per million is getting through, and I've got even less than that in the tank. So I'm actually putting nitrates in the tank with my groundwater, and then they are being used up. And I've been thinking more and more about it. I really don't have a lot of plants that are using a lot of nitrates. I guess my water sprite right here is starting to take off, and you can see I've got some fairly vigorous growth on that. All of this really lush green stuff you see around it is in planters, so that's not drawing nitrates out of the tank at all. And I have recently put this daylily in here, and you can see that's really growing vigorously. As of last night, I put some Ludwigia in there. I've got a little more of that tucked in here, and I've got a little more of that in the tank, but that only happened as of last night. So where is all of the nitrates in this tank going? And I think this tank is also experiencing some degree of denitrification. I spoke about that recently in this tank down here. I did not set it up to denitrify, but I think just because of the way I set it up, I think that's what's happening. I'll attach a card to that video if you're interested. But I think the same thing is going on in this tank, because remember, I don't have a lot of flow through the tank. A lot of water turns over in the sense that it gets pumped out from the bottom and flows back in at the top, and this little filter on the side here gives me a little bit of surface movement. And when the water level drops down a little bit, I get a little bit of a waterfall type effect, and it goes down and maybe swirls the water around on the bottom. But I don't have a real vigorous flow in this tank. I don't have any power heads or anything like that. I've got fairly deep gravel, and all of those big flat rocks that I've got lying on the gravel basically restrict the flow through that gravel. And I think because I'm creating all of this sort of slow movement of water through the gravel that's fairly deep, I think I'm probably getting a little bit, at least, of the denitrifying effect. Again, not intentionally, but I think that's what's going on, because I've always been puzzled why this tank has so few nitrates when it really probably should have a fairly significant amount when you consider all of the detritus and stuff that builds up in here. It's not real heavily stocked, but I do feed it fairly well. It's got a lot of snails in there. It's got wood that's in there breaking down and rotting. You know, I say rotting, but it's, you know, it's decomposing, all of that. If you've got wood in your tank that's not living wood, then it's decomposing, you know, fairly slowly, but it is producing waste products in your tank, you know, that is producing small amounts of ammonia that accumulate and, you know, end up as nitrates. So that's the only thing I can figure, is that I've got a little bit of denitrifying going on in this tank too. But my next step is going to be to find out whether or not that lack of nitrates and lack of nitrogen compounds, all, you know, ammonia is a nitrogen compound, nitrite is a nitrogen compound, and plants gobble them up too. And I just don't have any nitrogen compounds in my water, so I don't know how well this temple plant is going to do. So I might do a little experiment using some basic, you know, NPK macro fertilizers that I would use on my houseplants. I've been thinking more and more about that, and I think that's feasible and something to do. So make sure you're subscribed, and you won't miss that, because I'm going to be doing an upcoming video here, sort of tinkering around with some fertilizer and seeing what effect that has on my tank as far as dissolved solids and stuff like that. So I did check the dissolved solids in this tank, and I've only got 296 parts per million, and only less than 5 of those parts per million are parts of nitrates. So, you know, whatever's in this tank, it's not nitrates. It's probably all that Excel I dumped in there. Again, I did dump a big old sploosh in there, and I should have done under a little tiny cap full, and I probably dumped, you know, 1.5 ounces in there. I did a heavy shot glass full into the tank. So again, micronutrients, for the time being anyway, we got no problem with them. But as of the next water change, I'll probably get in there and we'll do a little experimenting with the I've got some Jack's all-purpose fertilizer, which I think is really good stuff. So we'll talk about that in an upcoming video. So like I said, make sure you're subscribed and you won't miss that or anything else I got coming up. And don't forget, of course, this one here is my waterfall tank. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you real soon in the next one.